What's up, everybody, and welcome back to First Fruits of Zion Reacts, where our mission is to provide you some light entertainment while teaching you something about the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective, and helping people negotiate whatever's going on out there in the world. A lot of people saying a lot of things. Today we've got a video where someone is saying how to follow the true biblical faith of Israel. And I don't have any idea what that means. So we'll see. If you like this video, head over to FFOZ.org, sign up for an account, and you'll get this neat dashboard with all kinds of new content all the time, all from a Messianic Jewish perspective, which is the way to understand the Bible, in my opinion. We'll give you a little something for free if you create an account. So without, that's enough of that. Let's see what this person has to say.
Billions call themselves Christians today. But did you know the first disciples never used that name? Acts 11 says they were called Christians in Antioch by outsiders. They never chose it. They saw themselves as part of Israel's story. Saints, faithful ones, the assembly of God. So here's the question. If the first followers of Jesus never called themselves Christians, then what does that make you? This isn't about abandoning faith. It's about rediscovering your true identity in the Messiah of Israel. My name is the Prophet 33, and I
hope he's not saying he's a real prophet, because that's maybe it's just his gamer tag or something, his internet handle. Just claiming to be a prophet is a serious thing. I'm not saying that he's not one, but if you claim to be a prophet and you're not, that's a serious problem. It's one of them things that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, could get you killed, rightfully so. So be careful about using that term. We have another thing I wanted to say at this early stage is sort of ask the question like, what's in a name, right? A movement can have a change in its name, just think of the early group of followers of Jesus. Right? They called themselves the Way. It didn't stick, right? It ended up being hundreds of years later, it's now called Christianity. Are there a lot of other changes that happened at that time, during that time? Oh yeah. Were they all good? Oh no. Are they necessarily related to the fact that it was called something else? Not necessarily, but I'm sure that what he has to say is going to go far deeper than the name. That's just his hook. I just thought I would say that.
You the word of God. The reason I wear a mask is because I am persecuted in my country for my faith. This mask protects my life. Let's continue. Have you ever felt a tension deep inside your heart? You love Jesus. You love Israel. You read the scriptures, and you sense that what God began with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still alive. And yet, when you look at the history of Christianity, something feels off. Here's the question I want us to wrestle with together. If the first followers of Jesus, Yeshua, walked the land of Israel as Jews, praying in the temple, keeping the feasts, living the Torah through the Messiah, then why do billions of us today call ourselves by a name they never used? Acts chapter 11, verse 26 says the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. But notice carefully, it doesn't say they called themselves Christians. It says they were called. This was a label given by outsiders in a Greek and Roman city, far from Jerusalem, far from the roots of Israel. So pause with me for a moment. If the earliest...
Again, sometimes a religious group will adopt a name that they wouldn't have necessarily chosen for themselves, but the name sticks and it's eventually adopted. When you read Jewish literature, most of the time you will find that they call themselves Israelim, or children of Israel, Israelites. The term Jew dates back to the Babylonian captivity, and the southern kingdom of Judah, right, was taken over by Nebuchadnezzar, and then the Persians came in and they took over from the Babylonians. And during that period, because these people came from the southern kingdom of Judah, the name Jew was applied to them. And may not have been something that would have been their favorite term for themselves, but we still use the word Jew today, and it's not a pejorative term. At least it shouldn't be. But just having a different name, hopefully that is some kind of metonym or some kind of a it's standing in for a deeper argument that he's going to make. As far as the problem he describes, where it seems like there's a lack of continuity between what's happening in the Old Testament and what we see today in the church. You should feel that tension. That's an important tension because I think something is wrong. I think the church has, in its theology, if not in its practice, it has, it's left some important things out. It's left out, the people of Israel and the Torah and these things. They don't occupy the right theological space or enough theological space. They're not treated fairly. They're not approached with enough seriousness. But so I guess in that respect, I like what he said. I think I want to see where he takes it.
Disciples never chose that name for themselves. What did they call themselves? And more importantly, what does that mean for us right now in our walk with God? That's what this entire journey is about. This is not just a story of words, but of identity. It's about rediscovering the faith of Israel, the faith of the prophets, the faith of the apostles, and asking the honest question. How do we return to it today? Let's go deeper into that word, Christian. Where did it come from, and why does it matter? In Greek, the word is Christianos. It literally means one who belongs to Christ. At first, that sounds beautiful. But here's the irony. For the early believers, Christ was not a new religious term. It was the Greek way of saying Mashiach, the Hebrew word Mashiach, the anointed one. For them, this wasn't a brand. It wasn't a new movement. It was the heartbeat of Israel's hope. The prophets had spoken for centuries about a son of David, a king who would redeem Israel, restore the covenant, and bring God's kingdom to earth. To call Yeshua the Christ was to declare he is the Messiah we have been waiting for. But here's the problem. In Antioch, outsiders didn't see that. They didn't understand the Torah, the prophets, the covenant. All they saw was a strange Jewish sect that kept talking about the Christ. So they gave them a label, Christianos, a nickname, not chosen, not embraced. And when you read the letters of Paul,
it was eventually embraced.
Something becomes even more striking. Not once, listen carefully, not once does he use the word Christian. Not in Romans, not in Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, or Thessalonians. Never. Instead, he calls the believers by other names. He calls them the saints, the holy ones, set apart for God. Romans chapter 1 verse 7 says, "To all who are in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints." He calls them the faithful, those who have put their trust in the Messiah. Ephesians chapter 1 verse 1, "To the saints who are in Ephesus, and faithful in Christ Jesus." And he calls them the assembly, ecclesia in Greek, the same word used in the Septuagint to translate the Hebrew kahal, the assembly of Israel. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 2, "To the church of God which is at Corinth." Do you see it? For Paul, their identity was never detached from Israel. They were the holy ones, the faithful ones, the covenant people, the very continuation of what God began with Abraham. So let's ask the question again.
I don't have a serious problem with anything he said there. I think it's good to emphasize the continuity that we have. If you're a non-Jewish follower of Jesus, the continuity that you have with what God was doing all through the Old Testament and with Israel, that continuity comes through the fact that you follow the Jewish king, Yeshua, right? You follow Jesus. And by virtue of that, Paul says, you're in, right? The apostles talk about this passage from Amos, the tent of David, right? The monarchy is restored. That's the tent of David. David's fallen tent is the monarchy, the Davidic monarchy. Jesus, as the rightful Davidic king, has his prerogative to rope in as many Gentiles as want to come into his group, and follow him, right? So I think in that sense, continuity with Israel, yes. There are people who get a little, they shove the pendulum too far, and they say so we are Israel, right? We are the continuity with what God was doing in the Old Testament, and with the only continuity with what God is doing in the Old Testament. And the Jewish people are not part of it anymore. And that's replacement theology. I don't think that's where he's going. But just to say that you could be a little careful throwing around the Israel term and talking about continuity without getting it, because it gets hairy. You got to be specific. And he's been really specific so far, so he probably will be as he goes on. Again, I don't watch these in advance. Sometimes I pause at inopportune moments. You get to watch me fall on my face. Isn't that fun?
If the first disciples didn't call themselves Christians, but rather saints, faithful, and the assembly of God, then what does that say about us today? If the earliest disciples didn't see themselves as Christians, then who were they? What was their faith? To answer that, we need to travel back, not to Antioch, not to Rome, not to later church councils, but back to Jerusalem, back to the city where Yeshua taught in the temple courts, where his disciples prayed daily, and where the movement was born. Acts 2 paints the picture. After the Spirit was poured out at Shavuot Pentecost, the believers didn't scatter to form a new religion. No, they devoted themselves to the apostles, teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and to prayers. Where did they pray? In the temple. What calendar did they live by? The calendar of Israel's feasts. What scripture did they read? The Torah, the prophets, and the writings. In other words, their faith was not Christianity. It was the faith of Israel, fulfilled in the Messiah. Now think about this. If you had walked through the streets of Jerusalem in the first century and asked...
It's weird that he says the faith of Israel and not Judaism. I wonder why. I mean, that's a choice, right? I wonder.
Those early disciples who they were. Do you think they would have said, we are Christians? Never. They would have said, we are the remnant of Israel who believe the Messiah has come. And this is crucial, because it wasn't only Jews, Gentiles, non-Jews, were joining them. But notice carefully how Paul describes it. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 12 to 13, he writes to the nations, "At that time you were without Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise. But now in Messiah Yeshua you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah." Did you hear that? He doesn't say they became members of a new religion. He says they were brought into the commonwealth of Israel. They were grafted
They're brought near.
in, adopted into God's covenant family. Romans chapter 11 uses the same image. The wild olive branches, the nations, being grafted into the cultivated olive tree of Israel, not replacing the tree, not starting a new one, but becoming part of the very people of God. So the faith of the first believers wasn't about leaving Israel behind. It was about Israel's Messiah opening the gates so that the nations could enter. That's why Paul calls this the mystery, that Gentiles would be fellow heirs, members of the same body, and partakers of the promise in Messiah Yeshua, Ephesians chapter 3, verse 6. This is the original faith.
Yeah, again, I don't have a big problem with what he's saying. We here at First Fruits are very sensitive to another important passage from Paul. He actually says it a few times, but the clearest is 1 Corinthians 7. Might as well bring it up. You guys like the Bible, right? Leave a comment if you like the Bible. Leave a comment with your favorite Bible verse. 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 17, "Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision." Circumcision and uncircumcision here mean Jewish identity and non-Jewish identity. And I know that for some of you who have not been exposed to that idea before, it seems like I'm making it up or like it's a stretch. This is not a stretch. I think the place where I've seen this laid out in the most succinct terms with the most footnotes and references this book here. Really interesting book by Mark Nanos called The Irony of Galatians. It cannot be proven, but is generally agreed among interpreters who may disagree about virtually everything else regarding what this letter meant or means, But the context of this language regarding circumcision is that which arises in terms of Jewish proselyte conversion. Yet the symbolic meaning is considered by most interpreters apart from a salient communal context in which this interest for or pressure upon Paul's Gentile converts makes psychological or sociological sense. Proselyte conversion involves a ritual process. It is a rite of passage, the completion of which for males is signaled by circumcision. Circumcision symbolizes, albeit oversimplified and over-individualistically set out, the completion of this rite of passage. Right? So circumcision is a metonym or a shorthand for conversion to Judaism or Jewish identity. And there's lots of great footnotes here to bolster that claim. I like how he, I just like how he puts that. Put it back. In other words, what Paul's saying here in 1 Corinthians 7 is that although, in spite of all the verses this guy just quoted, which are all true, partakers, the same body, grafted in, fellow heirs, absolutely, but not Israelites, right? If you are not Jewish at the time of your call, you're not supposed to seek circumcision or proselyte conversion or becoming Jewish. So that social distinction and a theological distinction in some way still remains in the body. So just anytime someone talks about this stuff and doesn't mention that, I feel the need to mention it. Because if you don't mention it, it starts to sound like there's no difference at all between Jew and Gentile, which means Jews, essentially we tried that, and it means Jews lose their Jewish identity when they become followers of Jesus, which is, well, the opposite of what we want. We want people to dig into their Jewish identity. We want them to become more fervent Jews. We want them to reconnect with their heritage, with Torah and tradition. So yeah, just thought I needed to mention that.
The biblical faith, the covenant faith, a faith rooted in Israel, open to the nations, and centered on the Messiah.
Has he said the word Judaism yet? Because it's really interesting to me if he never says that. The faith that he's talking about is called Second Temple Judaism. Or at least, or maybe not. Maybe he's got something else in mind, which would be bad. We'll see.
But now comes the burning question, the one that cuts to the heart. If this is how it began, if the first disciples and the first Gentile believers saw themselves as part of Israel's story, then how did it become something else? How did it drift so far that Christianity became separated, even hostile, to the people of Israel themselves? That is the story we need to face next. So far, we've seen that the earliest disciples did not call themselves Christians. They were Jews who followed their Messiah, and Gentiles who were grafted into Israel's covenant. This was the original faith rooted in Jerusalem, grounded in the Torah, the prophets, and the promises of God.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
If that's true, then we have to ask the hard question, how did we get from there to here? How did a Jewish Messianic movement become what we now call Christianity, often cut off from its roots and even opposed to them? The answer begins with history. After the resurrection and ascension of Yeshua, the faith spread quickly beyond Judea, Antioch, Asia Minor, Greece, Rome. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the number of Gentile believers far outnumbered the Jewish ones. And slowly, something began to shift. Instead of Gentiles seeing themselves as grafted into Israel, many began to see themselves as something new, something separate. Leaders arose who wanted to distinguish the faith from its Jewish foundation. By the time of the so-called Church Fathers men like Justin Martyr, Origen, and Augustine, the distance had grown wide. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, argued that Christians had replaced Israel as God's people. Origen taught that the destruction of Jerusalem was proof that God had rejected the Jews. Augustine declared that the church was the new Israel. And what followed was devastating. The Sabbath, the 7th day, commanded from creation and honored by Yeshua and his disciples, was set aside and replaced with Sunday. Passover, the feast that celebrated deliverance and redemption, was replaced with Easter, divorced from its biblical roots. The feasts of the Lord were cast aside as Jewish, while new traditions took their place. Even worse, the Jewish people themselves were branded as Christ killers. Persecution, exile, forced conversions, all done in the name of Christ. The very people through whom the Messiah came were now treated as enemies. Do you see the tragedy? What began as Israel's faith in the Messiah was transformed into a religion that often defined itself against Israel. The word Christian, once just a nickname from outsiders, now became a badge of separation. And here's the painful truth: this history still affects us today. It shapes how many read the Bible. It shapes how we think of the Old Testament versus the New Testament. It even shapes how many Christians see Israel itself. But here's the good news: history doesn't have to define destiny. The mistakes of the past don't have to control our future. The question is, what do we do with this knowledge? If we love Jesus, if we honor the Scriptures, if we see God's eternal covenant with Israel, how do we live out a faith that is not cut off from its roots, but deeply connected to them? That's where we're heading next. Let's pause. We've walked through history. We've seen...
He's just reflexively hit the pause button when he said that. I mean, I have an answer to that question, which is go to FFOZ.org and study the Scriptures from a Messianic Jewish perspective. This guy's doing great, but if you want a lot more detail on what he was just talking about, we have resources for you. Lots and lots of articles, books, and entire, multi-volume commentaries that will give you more and more and more information. I'm interested to see what his action item is here. Because things do change. Your theology changes. Your practice might change. There's things that change when you recover the Jewish foundation of your faith.
Seen how the word Christian was first an outsider's label. We've seen how the early believers lived as part of Israel's story, not a new religion. And we've seen how, over time, that story was rewritten, cut off from its roots. But now comes the most important question: what does this mean for you? Because you might be watching this as a committed Christian. You love Jesus. You read your Bible. You pray. Maybe you even love Israel and stand with the Jewish people. And now you're wondering, if the first disciples didn't call themselves Christians, if they didn't see themselves as a new religion, then what does that make me? Am I wrong to call myself a Christian? Does this mean I've been living a lie? I want you to hear me clearly. No. Loving Jesus is not wrong. The word Christian is not evil. But here's the challenge: it may not be enough. If all we have is a label, but not the identity behind it, we risk missing the fullness of the faith God intended. Think about it like this: if you adopt a name without understanding the story behind it, you can end up living someone else's story. That's what happened in history. The church took on a name that began to represent something disconnected from Israel, from the Torah, from the covenants, from the very roots of faith. But you don't have to repeat that mistake. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 11 that Gentile believers are grafted into Israel's olive tree. That's not just a metaphor, it's your identity. You are not replacing Israel. You are joining Israel's story through the Messiah. You are not part of a new religion. You are part of the covenant family of God. So let me put it plainly. If you believe in Yeshua, the Messiah of Israel, then your identity is not first and foremost Christian. Your identity is covenantal. You are one of God's people, joined to his promises, rooted in his word, and connected to his people Israel. That means when you read the Scriptures, you don't read them as an outsider looking in. You read them as someone adopted into the family. When you see the feasts, the Sabbath, the Torah, the prophets, you don't dismiss them as Jewish things. You see them as your heritage in Messiah. So ask yourself, what if your faith was never meant to be defined by separation from Israel but by connection to it? What if your calling is not to walk away from the roots, but to hold fast to them?
There's almost a both and situation going on here, because those are Jewish things, right? The Sabbath is actually a great example, because the Sabbath is the Sabbath because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, right? And there's two tellings of the story in the Torah of God giving the Ten Commandments. And in those tellings, we get two different reasons. Maybe we'll get into this. So in Exodus 20, right? Starting in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea. It's a reason, right? Why do all this? Because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Highly relevant to everyone in the world. highly relevant to everyone in the world, that we all got created, our planet got created. So you read that and you think, well, obviously this is going to have some kind of universal application, because we all find out the roots of our very existence in the event of the one God who exists, the creator, creating the world and creating all the animals and the people and stuff, and the plants and the bugs. But look at Deuteronomy 5. Deuteronomy 5, starting in verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Sounds familiar. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. That sounds familiar. That your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. This is different. He gives a different reason. And this does not have a universal application. My ancestors were not enslaved in Egypt. My ancestors, during that time, God help them, they were probably worshiping a tree or something like that. So it's not, this wouldn't be my reason necessarily for keeping the Sabbath. What this is talking about is it's that God bringing the children of Israel out from Egypt, leading them to Mount Sinai, making a covenant with them that they will keep the Torah, and the Sabbath ends up being one of the signs of that covenant. It's a sign of that covenant identity, not the identity he's talking about, the sort of vague idea of like God's people. Because you're a Gentile, you follow Jesus, you do become God's people. But you don't become an Israelite, you don't become Jewish. So there's this sort of dual face to the Torah, right? On the one hand, it has something to say to everybody, for sure. But on the other hand, some of the things it does say only to certain people. Laws of the priests are only for priests. The laws of the Levites are only for Levites. There are some laws that only apply to Jewish people. So just, you got to have that in mind when he's talking about embracing the Sabbath, embracing the festivals as your religious heritage. We embrace them as the Jewish religious heritage, keeping in mind that these commemorations are commemorations of what our God did, the God that we believe in. But he did them for the Jewish people. He made a covenant with them in Mount Sinai that we're not party to. But nevertheless, is there an appropriate way for Christians to engage with these things? I think obviously there must be. I mean, when you look at, we come back to the same passages over and over again, because we just keep talking about the same things. Because you already know what the rest of the Bible means. But 1 Corinthians 5, start in verse 6. Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival. So he's writing to the Corinthians. He's writing, Paul, right, is the apostle to the Gentiles. So there may be some Jews in that assembly, but he's really writing to deal with the Gentile problems. He's writing to Gentiles. And as you look at some of the other problems these people were having, it becomes clear he's writing to Gentiles. So yeah, Gentiles are engaging with the Passover in some way, but not as covenant Israelites. And this something to keep in mind.
Be nourished by them, to let them shape your walk with God. This is not about abandoning Jesus. It's about following him as he truly is, the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of Israel's hope, the one who opened the gates for the nations.
Oh, yeah.
So let me ask you personally, if this is who he is, and if this is who you are in him, then how should your life look different? That's the question we'll face next. So let's come back to the question we started with. I want to follow the biblical faith of Israel, but how? That's where so many sincere believers find themselves. You love Jesus. You've discovered that. He is the Jewish Messiah. You realize the first disciples were rooted in Israel's faith, not in a new religion. And now you're asking, what does that mean for my life? The first thing you need to know is this. You don't need to convert to Judaism in order to belong to the God of Israel.
Correct.
Paul never told the Gentiles in Rome, Corinth, or Ephesus that they had to become Jews. What he told them was that in Messiah they had been brought near to the covenants and promises. They were now insiders, not outsiders. So what are the first steps? Step 1. Return to the scriptures as Israel's story. When you open your Bible, don't split it into old versus new. See it as one story, God's covenant with Israel, fulfilled and open to the nations through Messiah.
This guy reads our stuff.
The Torah, the prophets, and the writings aren't background. They're the foundation. Yeshua himself said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, "I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them." Step 2. Learn God's calendar. The early believers lived by the rhythm of the feasts, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot. These aren't just Jewish holidays, they are God's appointed times. Each one points to Messiah. Passover points to the Lamb who was slain. Shavuot points to the Spirit poured out. Sukkot points
Torah.
to the kingdom yet to come. You don't need to celebrate them perfectly. You begin simply by remembering, by seeing how they reveal Yeshua. Step 3. Embrace the Sabbath as a gift. From creation itself, God set apart the seventh day as holy. Yeshua kept it. The apostles kept it. It was never abolished. For many Christians, Sunday became the day of worship, but the Sabbath was never erased from God's word. Learning to rest, to honor his rhythm, is part of returning to the faith of Israel. Step 4.
Yeah, the Sabbath is a special day. It should be a special day for you. That being said, I still go to church on Sunday. I love it. It's important not to forget that every day is a day of worship. The Sabbath is not primarily like, oh, this is the day that we worship, like for Jewish people. The worship is every day. There's some more prayers on the Sabbath than usual, but there's honestly not that many more. Most of the prayers you say, whether it's the Shmoneh Esrei or the Shema, like these are everyday occurrences. All of the blessings in the morning upon arising. Every day is a day of worship, right? Every day is the day of worship. Sabbath is holy and it's a day of rest. So it's a day where an observant Jew will not engage in creative work and trying to change something about the world, trying to affect some transformation, right, in the world. It's a day where you cease from doing that kind of thing. I knew a guy who had Jewish ancestry and it was recent enough that he's like, wow, I'm Jewish, but because the thread had not been carried along from generation to generation, the right thing for him to do was to undergo conversion, because he wasn't raised observant, right? So he's learning how to keep the Sabbath. And he related to me one time. By this time he had been studying for years on how to keep the Sabbath properly. And he related to me one time. He's like, it's like every week I learn something new. Every week it's like, oh, that also is part of this. So to keep the Sabbath according to traditional Jewish halacha is something that you really almost need like special training. It needs to be done under the guidance of a rabbi, probably. And it's not for, if you're a Gentile, it's not for you, but it is for Jews. That being said, you can have Sabbath evening meal, you can do special prayers, you can not go to work, you can rest, spend time with your family, spend time with God, have quiet time. Honor the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath. Yeah, I think it's very healthy. I think it's biblical. I think it's what the first generation Gentile followers of Jesus, they would have done something like that.
Live out the Torah through Messiah. This is where people often get confused. We are not called to legalism. We are not saved by works. But the Torah, God's instruction, is good. It teaches us how to love God and love people. Through the Spirit, we live it out not as a burden, but as life. Romans chapter 3, verse 31 says, "Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law." Step 5. See yourself as part of the people of God. You are not just an individual believer floating in history. You are part of a family rooted in Israel's story, joined with Jewish and Gentile believers together in Messiah. You are not replacing Israel. You are not erasing Israel. You are standing with Israel, honoring the covenant God made with his people, and living as one who has been grafted into that tree. Now, I know what...
Yeah, I could go on and on about this for a while, especially in America. You have our Christianity that we have here is often like just for you. It's your tailor-made thing, and you sort of pick and choose from all the religious traditions available to you and the different expressions of Christianity. You find something that's meaningful to you, and you're sort of on your own. You know, you might go to a church, but you don't agree with everything. And everyone has like their own personal Christianity in a sense. And that's not a problem with Christianity. It's a problem with our society. Our society, we do the same thing with like politics. We all have our own little universes that we live in, and we disagree with everyone about something and maybe everything. And people are feeling this. People are feeling a sense of community is not there. The sense of being in solidarity as a nation or in solidarity as a church, being really one body and really being there for each other and overcoming what our differences of opinion might be and really coming together as one, as a community. Instead, we each have our personal curated social media feeds, and it's like we've been ground down into powder, and each one of us a tiny molecule separate from all the rest. And it's kind of sad. It's kind of sad. Don't live like that. Don't live like that. Turn off your computer after this video is done. You know what? If you made it this far, we already got the views. So turn off your computer and join a book club. Honestly, go outside and talk to your friends. You know, be part of a community.
You might be thinking, this sounds overwhelming. Am I supposed to suddenly keep all the feasts? Am I supposed to do everything exactly like ancient Israel? No, this is not about adding rules to your life. It's about rediscovering your identity. It's about walking closer to the God of Israel by seeing his word through the eyes of the Messiah of Israel. And here's the beauty. You don't walk this path alone. The Spirit of God leads you. The scriptures guide you. And the Messiah himself is your teacher. So let me leave you with this question. If these are the first steps, what would it look like for you to begin taking them right now? Because what comes next is not just history or theology, it's a calling, and it's yours. We've talked about your personal journey, what it means to rediscover the biblical faith of Israel in your own life, but now we need to step back and see the bigger picture. Because this is not just about you, it's about God's plan for the nations and his everlasting covenant with Israel. Paul makes this clear in Romans chapter 11. He asks, "Has God rejected his people?" And he answers with passion, "May it never be. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin." In other words, Israel is not cast aside. God's covenant is eternal. But here's the mystery. Through Messiah, the nations have been invited in, not to replace Israel, not to form a competing religion, but to join in the covenant blessings of Israel's God. Think about it. For centuries, the prophets spoke of a day when the nations would come to Jerusalem, when the Torah would go forth from Zion, when the knowledge of the Lord would cover the earth. Isaiah chapter 2 says many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. For out of Zion shall go forth the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." That vision...
That's like the verse. That's the verse. That verse is the reason First Tree to Zion exists.
...is not about abandoning Israel. It's about the nations walking with Israel, learning from Israel's God, and honoring Israel's Messiah. Now let's be honest. For much of church history, that's not what happened. Instead of standing with Israel, many Christians stood against her. Instead of learning from Israel's scriptures, many dismissed them as old. Instead of honoring the Jewish roots of faith, many cut them off entirely. And yet, God is faithful. He has preserved Israel through exile, persecution, and even attempts at annihilation. And today, before our eyes, he is restoring Israel. The Jewish people are back in their land. The scriptures are being opened in new ways. And more believers around the world are asking the very question you're asking right now. How do I return to the biblical faith of Israel? This is not an accident. It's prophecy being fulfilled. The nations are waking up. The olive branches are longing for their roots. The covenant family is being prepared for the day when Messiah himself will return to Jerusalem. But here's why it matters for you. Your faith is not just personal, it's prophetic. When you choose to see yourself as grafted in, when you honor Israel's God, when you embrace his word in its fullness, you are living out God's plan for the nations. You are showing the world what it means to worship the God of Israel through his Messiah. And this also matters for Israel. For too long, Jewish people have looked at Christianity and seen only persecution, crusades, and forced conversions. But when they see believers who love Yeshua and honor the covenant God made with Israel, it tells a different story. It says, "We are not here to erase you. We are here to stand with you."
This guy's just
because
going to
your
steal
Messiah
all of
is
our ideas.
Messiah too. That is powerful. That is prophetic. And that is what God is calling this generation to rediscover. So let me ask you, if God's plan is to unite Jew and Gentile in one covenant family through the Messiah, where do you fit in that story? Are you living as part of that great mystery, or as someone disconnected from it? That's the challenge before us, and that's what we'll explore next. So far, we've traced the story from the first disciples in Jerusalem, through the separation of history, to the personal question of who you are in Messiah, and finally to the bigger picture of God's plan for Israel and the nations. But let's make this real. What does it actually look like to live this out today? How does a Christian who loves Jesus, who loves Israel, who wants to follow the biblical faith of Israel, actually begin to walk it out? Let me give you a few pictures. I know believers who every Friday evening gather their families around the table. They light candles, they break bread, they share wine or grape juice. They read from the scriptures and welcome the Sabbath. For them, this isn't about becoming Jewish. It's about honoring the God of creation, who set apart the seventh day and called it holy. Their children grow up seeing rest, joy, and scripture woven into the rhythm of life. I know churches where, instead of ignoring the biblical feasts, they've begun to rediscover them. At Passover, they set a table with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and they remember the blood of the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. At Shavuot, they rejoice in the gift of the Spirit. At Sukkot, they build booths and celebrate the hope of God's kingdom dwelling with us. These aren't empty rituals. They're living reminders of God's story, Israel's story fulfilled in Messiah. I know individuals who, when they read the prophets, no longer see them as distant history, but as living words for today. When Jeremiah speaks of the new covenant, they understand it as the covenant written on their hearts by the Spirit. When Ezekiel speaks of dry bones coming to life, they see the restoration of Israel and the nations joining in worship. When Isaiah speaks of the nations streaming to Jerusalem, they feel the pull of prophecy in their own lives. And I know Jewish people who have encountered Yeshua and discovered that believing in him doesn't mean leaving their heritage behind, it means fulfilling it. They've remained Jews, kept their identity, honored the Torah, and yet found the Messiah who brings it all to life. These are not isolated stories. They're part of a growing movement. Around the world, more and more believers are realizing faith in Jesus cannot be separated from Israel. To follow the Messiah is to join the covenant story. To love him is to love his people. To walk in his ways is to rediscover the very faith he lived. And here's the beauty. There isn't one formula. Some will take small steps, reading the Torah portions each week, learning the Hebrew roots of the New Testament. Others will begin to keep the biblical feasts. Some will simply shift how they see themselves, not as outsiders to Israel's story, but as grafted-in members of God's family. The point is not to become something you're not. The point is to rediscover who you truly are in Messiah. So ask yourself, what would it look like in your life to begin living the faith of Israel today? What would change if you saw yourself not as part of a religion invented later, but as part of the covenant people God has always had? Because here's the truth, when you take even one step in this direction, you are joining a story bigger than yourself, a story that stretches from Abraham to the prophets, from Yeshua to the apostles, from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. And that story is still being written. We've looked at the past,
there's a whole no errors detected vibe from this whole video. He really seems to be on it. He's using biblical language, and I made some clarifying comments, some clarifying remarks, but I feel like he hasn't really crossed the line here. That being said, I would soften this a little bit, because for Christians who are not taking these steps, he's making it sound like they're not part of the story, and they are. And all the generations of Christians who came before are part of the story. They are the reason that we're here today. They passed down what they had, the scriptures, right? And it's because of them that we have the Bible now, and can read it and come to the knowledge of the truth. So I don't want to. He's dunking on Christians more than I would. More than I would. You're part, even if you do know things that he's telling you to do, you are still part of the story. That being said, there's a lot of reasons to go down the path that he's advocating here of recovering a Jewish reading of the scriptures and recovering these things that have been lost. The Torah has a lot to say to us, even if we're not Jewish, and many of our problems as the church, I think, are rooted in a failure to give the Torah its pride of place and its role. It has an important role. It's like he said, the Torah and the prophets and the writings are foundational. But other than that, he's not going off being really wrong about stuff here. If we can keep watching to the end, but a very positive impression of the things that he's saying is because they're the same things that we say at First Street to Zion.
Asked what it means for you today, but now we need to ask a bigger question. Why does all of this matter for the future? Because the truth is this: the way we define our faith today shapes what the body of Messiah will look like tomorrow. If we continue to build on a foundation that is disconnected from Israel, we will end up with a version of faith that Yeshua never intended. But if we return to the roots, if we rediscover the biblical faith of Israel, we prepare for the future God has promised. Think of Yeshua's own words in John chapter 4, verse 22. Salvation is from the Jews. That wasn't just a statement about history. It was a prophetic declaration about the future. God's plan has always been to bring salvation to the nations through Israel. And that plan has not changed. The prophets speak of a day when all nations will worship the God of Israel together. Zechariah chapter 14 describes the nations coming up year by year to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Isaiah chapter 66 speaks of the nations bringing offerings to Jerusalem and worshiping before the Lord. Revelation chapter 7 shows a great multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language standing before the throne and the Lamb. What unites them? Not a label, not a man-made religion, but the covenant of God fulfilled in the Messiah of Israel. This means that the future of the body of Messiah is not Christian in the way history has defined it. The future is covenantal. The future is Israel-shaped.
He's got this bifurcation going. He's got this either-or thing going. And again, he's dunking on Christians, I think, a little too much. We've come a long way from worshiping trees. Give us a break. There's some serious errors. There are some serious misinterpretations. There's a serious problem of being disconnected from Israel and the Jewish people. At the same time, that doesn't mean Christianity is like fake or made up. It is rooted in the scriptures. Just because there are some problems doesn't mean that you toss everything, right? So you have to be a little careful, because you can set up like an us versus them thing, and the church becomes evil or like the bad guy. And if you're a medieval Jew, it certainly is. But the church has come a long way. The church, in many ways, has reformed a lot of these, and is in the process of reforming these anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic views that it's held historically. And, they're probably not going to abandon the label Christian as they do that, and that's fine. What's important is that the underlying theology changes, and that that people begin to orient themselves, in such a way as they're reading the scriptures from a Jewish perspective, and they are, standing with the Jewish people in solidarity. And don't go too far. The church is not the enemy. The church is, they just have some problems that they need help with.
Future is Jew and Gentile together, one new man in Messiah, walking in God's ways, living out his word, honoring his promises. And this is why it matters so much right now, because if we don't return to the roots, we risk building a faith that looks nothing like what God intended. We risk missing the fullness of his promises. We risk teaching the next generation a version of the gospel that has been edited by history instead of revealed in Scripture. But if we do return, if we humble ourselves, if we learn from the Scriptures, if we embrace the faith of Israel through Messiah, then we will be preparing the body for the days ahead, days of testing, days of shaking, days when only those who are rooted deeply will stand firm. And even more than that, we will be preparing for the greatest day of all, the return of the Messiah himself. Because when he comes, he will not return to Rome. He will not return to a cathedral. He will not return to a man-made tradition. He will return to Jerusalem, to the Mount of Olives, to his people Israel. So let me ask you again, if the future of faith is rooted in Israel, shouldn't your faith be rooted there too? If salvation is from the Jews,
Yes.
shouldn't your life reflect that reality? This is not
Yes.
just about history, this is about destiny, and it is your calling. We've walked a long road together, from Jerusalem to Antioch, from the apostles to the church fathers, from the faith of Israel to the religions of men, from history to your identity to the destiny of God's people. And now the question remains, who are you really? If the first disciples never called themselves Christians, if they lived as part of Israel's covenant story, if Gentiles were grafted in, not to a new religion, but into the commonwealth of Israel, then what does that make you? Maybe you've worn the name Christian your whole life. Maybe it's been your identity, your community, your story. And I want to say again, the word itself is not evil. But here's the truth. It was never the foundation. It was never the heart. It was never the identity of the first followers of Yeshua. Your true identity is not found in a label. It is found in a covenant, in belonging to the God of Israel through his Messiah, in being grafted into his people, in walking in his ways. That means you are not a stranger to the scriptures. You are part of their story. You are not cut off from the promises. You are an heir of them. You are not outside of Israel. You have been brought near. And here is the challenge. Will you live like it? Will you keep following a version of the faith that history edited? Or will you return to the faith that God himself revealed? Because the choice is in front of you. You can continue to define your faith by a word given in Antioch, or you can define it by the word of God given in Jerusalem. You can cling to a name created by outsiders, or you can cling to the name above every name, the Messiah of Israel, Yeshua. This is not about abandoning your past. It's about rediscovering your roots. It's about aligning your faith with God's eternal covenant. It's about walking as a saint, a faithful one, part of the assembly of the living God. And here is the hope. When you choose this path, you are not alone. You are joining a remnant of believers around the world who are waking up to this truth. You are joining Jewish and Gentile disciples who see themselves not as divided but as one new man in Messiah. You are preparing for the day when every nation will go up to Jerusalem, when every knee will bow, when the Messiah will reign as king. So I leave you with this question, the same one we started with. If you want to follow the biblical faith of Israel, how will you begin? The time has come to rediscover the original language of faith, not just in words, but in heart, in identity, in mission.
A lot of facts in this video. And a lot of good small action items. Do something with the Sabbath. Honor the Sabbath. The rhythm of your spiritual year is going to be so much more enhanced if it's rooted in the biblical festivals. Right? I'm recording this on the fast of Gedalia, the day after the second day of Rosh Hashanah, so the 3rd of Tishri. know where you are on the biblical calendar and try to get that yearly rhythm, the weekly rhythm of the Sabbath, the yearly rhythm of the festivals. God put those all in there for a reason. They're very helpful and conducive to spiritual growth. The repentance at Yom Kippur, the journey from Pesach to Shavuot, and the work on yourself that you're always doing on the Jewish calendar. You're always working on yourself. And that's a big component of the life of discipleship. So a lot of facts. Here's where our road goes in a different direction than this guy. He doesn't talk about Judaism. He doesn't talk about Messianic Judaism. He talks about like true Israel Bible faith. Using that language can send you in a lot of different directions. It's not necessarily like an incorrect thing to say. Not necessarily an incorrect thing to say, but leaving out Judaism and leaving out Messianic Judaism is just something we wouldn't do. I'm not going to say necessarily, definitely that's a red flag against any of the other things this guy has said. But what I will say is, if this is where you're at, if these are the questions you have, and these sound like good answers to you, I would suggest that rather than like he said here, community is a big part of it. I would suggest rather than going off on your own, I would suggest that a good way to become part of a movement where this is happening, these questions are being answered, and people are living these truths out, is First Fruits of Zion's small group Bible study, Torah Club. There's other options. Maybe there's a Messianic Jewish synagogue near you. That would be cool. Maybe you could visit there, see if it's a good fit. But there's a lot more Torah clubs than there are Messianic Jewish synagogues. And there's a better chance there's going to be one close to you. And what we offer that I'm not seeing in this video is the structure, the guardrails and boundaries that come from doing this exploration that he's doing securely within a Jewish context. Because without the guardrails of Jewish tradition, Jewish liturgy, Jewish halacha, Jewish law, without a really Jewish context for the New Testament. Like if you're just saying, well, it's Israel, so like ancient Israel and then New Testament, and we're not going to be looking at like Talmud or Midrash or any of these other works of Jewish literature to help us get into that zone, help us to get into the Jewish mindset, help us keep us from going off in strange directions. That's really a strength we have here at First Fruits of Zion, is that we take the body of Jewish literature very seriously, and it helps keep us from going off the rails. So if this is where you're at, I would suggest get a group together and do Hayasod. Hayasod addresses all the things that he's saying, but in more detail and from a distinctly Jewish perspective, a Messianic Jewish perspective. And then, join a Torah club, and you'll be getting that perspective every week, and it will help inform and shape how you read the scriptures. And, all the concerns and questions this guy raises, they are the same concerns and questions, the same tension that we feel when we look at the scriptures and we look at the church and we see what's missing. And all that being said, you don't have to leave the church. The church is not made up. The church, like he sometimes would use the term man-made, which I don't like, because the church has continuity, right, with what Jesus was doing and with the apostles. There is continuity. You can see the continuity. But he used the term edited. Things were edited. And that's a better way to look at it, I think. There are things that are lost along the way that can be recovered and restored. And that's, to me, I'm an optimist. And I think that is the destiny of the church, will be to recover and restore those things. But yeah, a Messianic Jewish perspective is a good, theologically robust, scripturally grounded perspective from which to attempt to answer these questions, address these concerns, address that tension, and start bringing some of these things into your life in a positive way. So, Yeah. Go to FFOZ.org, find all these, you can find all these resources there. You can find Torah Club there. You can find Hayasod there. If we might have a book about something that you're interested in. We have books about the Sabbath. We have books about the festivals, all these other things that you mentioned. Sign up for an account, get a free book, and stay tuned, because we're probably going to keep making more of these videos. You can also keep watching them. Get a little at a time. Thanks for watching.